Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Hansen, the Executive Director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and we're glad to have you here, which we truly are. We will go ahead and jump right in. As always, we are grateful to our partners who make these programs possible, and those would be, in this particular instance, the Ramsey County Library System, the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment through the state of Minnesota, which provides funds through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and then to the library system for programming like this. And of course, without the support of our members at the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, none of us would be here and we wouldn't be able to do such things. So, this is a fun program for us. They're all fun, I guess. I'm biased, but this is a little bit different type of program for us. We've been trying over the last several years to dig a little deeper into some of the stories we think we know or we want to know more about, and sort of unwrap those a little bit more. And so this is one of those stories about the Fillebrown House that we've always heard the basics. We've always known that there was a nursery school there and Amy Benson was the teacher. But beyond that, didn't have a ton of information. We are aware of a few folks who went to school there over the years. But other than that, didn't know a whole lot about it. And so it's been fun to dig into a bit. We were supposed to actually do this presentation last fall and had to postpone. So it gave us a little more time to play and continue to dig, I guess. But ultimately, one of the sort of inspirations for this program was actually a set of scrapbooks or photo albums that we have, and you'll see a lot of those images throughout the program tonight, but a set of scrapbooks or photo albums that have wonderful images of the house filled with kids. And that is something I've been with the Historical Society since 2001 and was a huge fan of the Fillebrown House, even as a child, pretty much since its tours and things started there. And ultimately, that's just not an image I ever think of when I think of the house. It was adults almost entirely coming and going, and certainly piano students and other things. But to see these images filled with children and the energy is just very exciting. So, and we're also happy to bring this program to you during Women's History Month, because as you've probably learned over the years as we've gone through different presentations, the house is filled with stories of women in particular. On the right here, you see Helen Brown, who was the matriarch ultimately and really the driving force for the Historical Society acquiring the house and for it being preserved in the way that it has been. And also the sort of hub of the wheel that has brought all of the people to that house over the years. And so you'll hear a little bit about Helen and actually some of her own words about the nursery school as time went on. And then on the left, you see Hattie Long, who is a completely different story, also education related. But Hattie was a pioneer in special education and a boarder at the house for 34 years. So she was a huge part of that story. And again, one of the many women that Helen sort of gathered around her and supported and encouraged, along with them encouraging her in her endeavors as time went on. So we'll go ahead and jump into Amy Benson. So this particular picture I think is great. It's one of my favorites. It's not actually at the Fillebrown House, but this is Miss Benson with a number of the children. And if you look at the individual expressions on their faces, they just crack me up. And you'll see this throughout many of the programs or many of the photos in the program. It's an interesting piece, but you can tell that Amy, or Miss Benson, of course, as she would have been called, loved to be with the children and they love to be with her. And that is something that we picked up time and again from people's comments, and the enthusiasm and the passion for what she was doing is apparent throughout. So we'll go ahead and dive in. Without the house itself, the story wouldn't be something that we would know as much about. So we'll give just a real quick background on that. The Fillebrown House was built in 1879 as a lakeside cottage by Charles and Emily Noyes, or for Charles and Emily Noyes and their family. And that's who you see here. They actually only spent 2 summers out at the lake. They were residents of St. Paul, as were all of the owners originally of the Fillebrown. It is actually listed in the National Register of Historic Places as the Charles P. Noyes Cottage, because that is who built it or had it built first. And ultimately, Charles and Emily spent, like I said, their first 2 summers or so here. And then the island out in the middle of the lake became available, and they purchased shares on Manitou Island and were able to build out there. in the early 1880s. And so they sold the cottage, the Fillebrown that you see here. At that point, it would have just been the front portion of the house. So it's interesting if you look at the part to the right of your screen, the part to the back was actually a summer cottage or summer kitchen and separate cottage for family and others to come stay. And that wasn't pulled up and added until the 1920s, which was really something that sort of shifted the entire piece of the house, or this entire use of the house, and again made this nursery school opportunity possible. So when the Noyes family moved on, they sold the house to the Youngs, George and Ellen, who you see here. Charles and Emily actually had a couple of small children in the house. They actually had one child pass away during their time that they owned the Fillebrown. So there were children in the very beginning, small children in the very beginning, but not a lot of them. And then George and Ellen, when they purchased the house in 1881, they were there during the summers until 1905. And they didn't have any children of their own. They had an adult nephew who came with them at times, but not small children. And so then they sold the house to Walter and Harriet Fillebrown, who you see here. So it's really just been those three families involved over the years. J. Walter, who you see on the left, and Harriet Fillebrown here, when they bought the house in 1905, again, they lived in St. Paul, intended for it to be a summer cottage, place to come out, although they did we do have letters and things that talk about them being out there over the New Year's holiday or out there to ice skate and do other things. So they did start to sort of embrace it in the colder months as well. And then by 1920, they actually decided to live there year round. Harriet and Walter had Helen and Arthur, who you see here. Helen is the older child, and then Arthur is the younger child. And yes, that is Arthur. That is a boy. It is a dress, basically. That was very common for small young children to wear similar clothing, regardless of their gender in those days. And so there's about an 8-year age difference between Helen and Arthur. And so you'd think maybe they weren't particularly close as siblings, but they actually were. By the time they bought the house at the lake, Helen was an adult and Arthur was in his teens. So it was certainly not a childhood place for them by any means, but again, a place that they loved and came together. And Helen had studied abroad and was trained to be a concert pianist. She had studied in Berlin for quite a long time. And then when she came back to the United States, she decided she didn't want to perform on the stage. And so ultimately she continued. She had always taken in piano students, and she actually had her own studio in St. Paul for a while and continued that out of the house. And so children would come from that perspective, but not to the degree that you're going to see in just a few moments. So interestingly, in the center of the photo here, the fellow at the head of the table is Charles Buckby. And Charles Buckby is kind of an interesting character in his own right. In the sort of strange small town kind of feel or small town kind of world that White Bear is, we encounter the Buckby family in and out of the story throughout and in a variety of ways, and in and out of the Fillebrown story in the Fillebrown house, or the story of the Fillebrown house. So we see Mr. Buckby here, Charles, and then we see Sue, his wife, here on this side. Ultimately, it's interesting. Charles Buckby was mayor of White Bear Lake, which is neither here nor there. But Charles and Sue's daughter, Barbara, was actually a piano student of Helen's and plays into some of this story as we go as well. Helen's, how do I describe this? Helen had a lot of creative ways over the years. So Walter and Harriet passed away in the 1930s. And of course, as they aged, they were less active from a professional standpoint. They did have rental properties and other things. And Walter had a wholesale produce company in St. Paul that was very successful. And so they used those funds, of course, as you can imagine, to support the house and to support the family. Well, as time went on and they aged, they needed to come up with other opportunities. And Arthur was actually a traveling salesman. He worked for the family produce company for a number of years, and then they shut down that company, and he went on to work for others around the state of Minnesota and was a salesman regionally. So he was gone a lot of the time. And so it was Helen in the house who had to come up with creative ways to raise funds. So ultimately, she had the piano students that brought in money. They did have, as I said, some other rental properties and things, but she started to bring in boarders. They had this house with several bedrooms, and they always had family around. They always had aunts and cousins and others who came to stay with them as they needed to. And so the house was always full with somebody, but she would certainly, like Hattie Long, would bring in a boarder and have them stay, rent a room for a period of time. And by the 1930s, as the Depression was wearing on, the ideas got a little more creative. So this is where Sue Buckby, the wife of Mayor Buckby, enters the scene. And ultimately, it's good that I have to think this through, because it becomes a little bit intertwined and complicated, as small town politics can. But ultimately, Mrs. Buckby approached Helen and asked her if she'd ever considered having a tea room in the Fillebrown house or in their home. And so in an oral history that we have, Helen says, I don't know, but everyone was a little bit hard up. And Mrs. Buckby thought it might be possible to earn a little money having a tea room. So she called me up and asked me if I had ever thought of having a tea room. I said, no, but it sounds intriguing. This was in the 30s, just after the Depression. I'm sure of that because we were all hard up. Well, she said, I'd like to have the DAR join and have a tea room. That part fell apart a little bit. They turned it down and thought that it would never work out. But two of the members of the DAR decided that they would come together and be a part of this. So May Alexander and Iva Minzer decided that if Sue wanted to start this thing, they'd volunteer to be the cooks. So Sue could wait on the tables and they would be the cooks. But of course, they didn't have any capital to start. And so Helen offered up the house. And ultimately, her goal, Helen was a notorious barter. She would barter for furniture, she would barter for services. And so her ultimate deal was that you can use the house for your tea room, but you have to provide a meal for each day that they had the tea room open. They had to provide a meal for Helen and her parents or whomever was still in the house. So Helen and her mom and dad, or Helen and her, at one point it was Helen and her dad and her aunt, and others who might be coming. So ultimately, it worked, as she said, it worked out very nicely. According to Helen, her mother and dad were very cooperative. And in fact, they got a great deal of enjoyment out of it, I'm sure, with people coming and going. And the house, of course, was always filled with people. She said in the first year, they used the large living room and the front porch. And she thought it was so far from the kitchen. They were out towards the front of the house and not in near the kitchen area, that the next year they decided to do it more in the middle room, which is the room where the nursery school would end up. And it was just easier to work with. Ultimately, interestingly, by the end of that second season, so this was the summer of this was 1934, typically the summer, and 1935. By the end of the season in 1935, they were having issues with some of the neighbors, and people weren't thrilled with what was going on. And so one of the neighbors actually filed a suit against and filed a complaint with Mayor Buckby, who, of course, was the mayor of White Bear Lake at the time. He was the mayor during the 30s and early 40s, and ultimately was challenging the tea room at the Fillebrown home, which, of course, was the idea or the concept created by Mayor Buckby's wife, Sue. So it gets a little bit interesting, but ultimately they took it to court. They actually went before a judge. The judge ultimately dismissed the case and said that the zoning violation that they thought was an issue was the zoning code was filed incorrectly and ironically had been actually petitioned for by the Fillebrown parents earlier, about a decade earlier, but had been filed incorrectly by the neighborhood, and ultimately things didn't hold. So they dropped the case and they did not have to shut down the tea room. But by that point, things had started to sort of fall apart on their own. And ultimately by 1936, the chalet had sort of fallen apart. But that continued on for a little, or that piece, things continued on quietly in that space, I guess is what I'm trying to say, for a little bit. And ultimately the next big idea that came along for the Fillebrown, what we call the middle room or the dining room, is Amy Benson and her nursery group. So here you see Amy Benson. This is a posting that was in the White Bear Press in October of 1946. And it's a little fuzzy, but it says Miss Amy Benson, 117 7th Street, started a nursery group this week holding classes at 303 Lake Avenue, which is the address for the Fillebrown. Morning classes only are being held this term. 12 children, 3 and 4 years of age, have been enrolled. Nursery group training for preschool children is becoming an established thing, and White Bear is fortunate to have its own center under the capable supervision of Miss Benson. So it's kind of intriguing. Again, Miss Benson actually has a connection to the Buckbees. She was essentially an adopted daughter. And we'll hear about that in just a moment. But ultimately, she ended up living with them. I don't know if it was officially an adoption, but she ended up living with them for many years, in fact, throughout her life. And so she knew Helen Fillebrown through the family and through the community, I'm sure. But again, in that same oral history, Helen talks about how this all came to be. And she says, it was in 1946 that Amy Benson telephoned one morning. Amy Benson was a friend of mine. She telephoned and asked if she could come down and see me. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and I knew something was up, but I wondered. When she got into the house, she said, "Have you any room in this house where I could have a nursery school?" I didn't know what a nursery school was, and when she came in, I thought it was probably a place where the children would come and they would sit around and she'd tell them stories, and that would be that. But I said, I don't know, let's look around. That pretty much epitomizes Helen's attitude about just about anything. She was pretty much game for trying anything, and especially if it was something creative that might produce income or whatever. But she was very easygoing in that sense. And she goes on to say, so we looked through this room, meaning the middle room, dining room area, and she thought that it would be just fine. So immediately she telephoned the supervisor in St. Paul. The supervisor was out in about an hour or so, and he thought it was just fine. So I said, let's have a nursery school. It seemed that Amy had intended to have it at the Webster School, which you see here, which was just down a couple blocks down the street. But she found that it interfered with the gymnasium activities. And she'd already sent out the notices to the parents of small children and invited the mothers to come on a certain date. And she found herself without a place for them to show up. We decided to have a nursery school, says Helen. It was a weekend in October that we had to move out the furniture in here, which comprised our big piano, a 4-poster bed, because we had been using it for a sleeping room for some of our summer guests. And all of that had to be moved out. And the old secretary was on the east wall, and we couldn't find anyone to move the furniture for us. Everyone had duck or deer hunting. So Amy and I worked together over the weekend and took the bed apart and took the springs and found room for them somewhere. And you wouldn't believe this, but it's very easy to roll that big piano from place to place because the casters are so wonderful. So this is the piano they're talking about. This is the Steinway that sits in the parlor of the Fillebrown House today. And I'm sure it is wonderful with the casters, but I can tell you that it's not necessarily fabulous to move. But she says, we got the piano in the other room and we took the 4-poster. Well, we got the bed apart. When it came to the secretary, the big hutch, we couldn't get it through the archway because it's pretty tall. So we had to leave that and didn't end up being able to move it until after the school had started. But we had a nursery school. Helen goes on to say, but then Amy began moving her things in, and I was so astounded when I saw the blocks and all the tables and all the little chairs and these things that she was bringing in, and she was just dancing over them, and she looked so happy. But I covered my amazement, I think. And by the time Monday came for the ladies to be entertained in the front part of the house, while the children got together and learned what it was all about out here, our nursery school was started, and it lasted for 10 years. I think this is one of the things that Helen was most proud of, this and her piano teaching throughout her years. It was the way she talks about it in this interview is just fascinating. And so it's fun to be able to see. But these are just a couple of the photos. And again, we'll see others as we go. But ultimately, you can see there are tables, there are chairs, there are bookcases filled with blocks and toys and other things, and all kinds of fun stuff. The kids are gathered. This is all in the middle space, the dining room space at the Fillebrown. That first session, she had 12, Miss Benson had 12 children to start and 15 later on. but that was the max they could allow. We had so many interesting adventures, Helen said. Of course, it was also 6 grown-ups living in the house around the edges. Every room was rented, but everybody cooperated and everybody enjoyed, I think. We certainly enjoyed Miss Amy, a charming person. So if you can imagine, they were renting out all of the bedrooms plus any extra spaces. As you heard Helen say, the 4-poster bed had been in what is effectively the dining room throughout the summer. And so they used any space they could. We have stories of the pantry area off the hallway between the kitchen and the dining room space having served as a bedroom for Arthur when he would come home, because she had rented out every other spot. So he would put an army cot in the pantry and sleep there. There are all kinds of similar stories like that, or where people would bunk together in the studio over the kitchen or other places, just because that was what they had. But I can't imagine bringing in, a dozen or 15 little ones and and typically the boarders were older, single women, but older, or men from the family, but not often. It was usually the women, the aunts and the cousins and things, and then older women from the community who were renting there. So just an interesting mix, a combination of multi-generational energy going on in that house. So, but Miss Benson brought the little ones in full force. And the fact that it continued on for a decade is sort of fascinating to me. Amy Benson was a student at McAllister College in the 1920s. But she had an interesting childhood. It was certainly not conventional. She was born to Carl and Clara Benson in January of 1902. Her mother, Clara, died in 1910, so Amy was just 8 years old, and Carl died in 1924, so not too much later. Amy was the oldest of her siblings, and from what we can tell, it gets a little bit sketchy, but from what we can tell, they were separated at some point after their mother died, which was fairly common during that time period. Carl actually appears in the 1910 census shortly after Clara died as widowed, and he is living alone. He's working and living on his own in St. Paul. By the 1920 census, Amy is 18 years old, enlisted as a servant in a home in Bald Eagle. So she's made her way, she's out here and working at that point on her own. And by 1930, Amy and her birth sister Alice Benson are living in the home of Charles and Sue Buckby, who you saw a little while ago. During the 1930 census, Alice and Amy are listed, they're categorized as adopted daughters of the Buckbys. So like I say, I don't know if that was formal, if that was legal and official, or if that was just the way they looked at it. In a later census, Amy is actually listed as a boarder, so it's hard to say how that played out, but they certainly stuck together through the years. The Buckbys had 2 other children, Alan and Barbara suffered from polio. Amy served actually as her tutor and certainly a friend as well, but as a tutor for her, and so that was probably how the relationship began and grew ultimately. But as I said, Miss Benson was at McAllister College, and then during the 1930s, she worked at Wiper High School as an office assistant and a librarian. We don't have anything saying that she was a teacher at the high school, just working in the library and in the office, but it's certainly possible. By the 1940s census, as I said, she's listed as a lodger with the Buckbys and is working as a stenographer at the bank. By that point, Alice is married and moved out on her own. So, but by the fall of 1946, as we said, Amy had her eye on a new project. She was bound and determined to have a nursery school, and since Webster School fell apart, she wanted to do it at the Fillebrown. She actually created what would be the first nursery school in White Bear. And I truly believe, as Helen's words would indicate, that when she agreed to holding the nursery school in her house, I think it's fairly safe to say that she had no real understanding of what a nursery school was. We've been chuckling a little bit in the office because when I look at pictures like this with kids riding tricycles throughout the house, as a historian and as a preservationist, there's a part of me that's absolutely horrified to see bicycles riding around and ramming into. As a mother, I know what this could look like, to see trikes riding around into the woodwork and other places. But ultimately, It, obviously this was before the house became a museum or historic site, and it is definitely part of the story. And again, you can just feel the energy as we go through some of these photos of what was happening. Miss Benson, it's unclear whether she had true formal training to be a nursery school teacher. The whole idea of nursery school was fairly new and fresh at this point, but ultimately she certainly engaged. It wasn't just a daycare. It wasn't just to drop your kids off for a few hours and they'd be taken care of. She really embraced the bigger idea of nursery schools. And really that whole concept had started in about 1910, 1911 in London by a couple of ladies named Margaret and Rachel Macmillan, where they opened the open air nursery school and training center in London, which sounds a little onerous, but it was in an effort to prevent the physical and mental health problems they observed in poor communities. The program provided children with nutritious food, regular health inspections, planned activities, and support from attentive teachers. So I think they got pretty much all of these things in the version that happened here in White Bear, with the possible exception of nutritious food, because there's a number of photographs of the kids drinking Coca-Cola from bottles with straws. So they may have, had a few different things going on, but that's okay. The nursery school movement itself migrated from England to the United States in the 1920s. And of course, the Depression and World War II slowed things down in general. But with the baby boom immediately following the war, the timing was perfect for Amy to jump in and get some of these things going. So ultimately, you can see, again, I laugh. We don't allow open flame at the Fillebrown House these days. And so it makes me sort of chuckle and panic a little bit to see the kids, again, both from a mother standpoint and from the historian standpoint, to be walking around with candles burning and that sort of thing. And there are a number of photos like that in the albums. But they had all kinds of activities. They had all kinds of toys and things going on. You can tell they experimented, and I'm not sure what they're doing exactly here, but they're obviously blowing bubbles and experimenting. It looks like they have different containers and things, and figuring out how bubbles work, or what creates carbonation or bubbles to happen. They had, here's one of the photos of the Coca-Cola. No straws, I guess, in this one, but or at least for the fella on the right. But you'll see, certainly they had a bird. They had a class pet, or a pet at the nursery school itself. Ultimately, one of the things that sort of fascinated me is going through these images are the pictures that you see on the wall. So this little space behind the table, there are a lot of photos of this table, and there's constantly changing artwork. And some of it appears to have been artwork from the kids themselves, I would guess, but some of it appears, or a lot of it appears to have been things that Miss Benson would have put together on her own and put up there for different themes or different ideas, much like decorating a classroom. The art and the opportunity, as you can imagine, in a home where Helen Fillebrown was involved, there had to be music involved. And so there clearly were band instruments and other things. And again, I'm certain that when Helen agreed to this, she didn't expect Amy to be hauling in all of these different things, but there, as you can see from the different toys and the different blocks and trucks and music instruments and other things, they had quite the good time. Again, some of the facial expressions crack me up as we go through, and some of the kids are just so serious about their work as they look at their different projects. But music from everything from, again, not handmade, but actually creating the music yourself with the instruments, and to doing things with the record players and other features. Art inside and out, lots of painting pictures, lots of activities like that if the weather was good, so they could be outside with their easels and doing all sorts of projects even when the weather wasn't so great. You can see them dressed for the weather and out there probably in the early spring, getting the kids out to see what they can do. And reading seemed to be, this is probably the only thing that Helen predicted accurately as far as her expectations, that they'd read some stories and that would be that. Lots of water experimentation, typically outside, fortunately, but again, certainly figuring out a lot of creative free play from what it looks like. I think they had organized activities quite a bit, but also a fair amount of time to just be kids and be out there and figure out what they had going on. Interestingly, you can see some of the shots, or a few others coming as well, but some of the shots of the sandbox. There are a couple of variations or versions on the sandbox in the yard, and it's fascinating to me. If anyone has been by the Fillebrown yard in the last 20 or 30 years, you'll know that there's really no sign of children. There's no swing set, there's no anything. And if you look throughout the years in these photos, there are slides and swing sets and jungle gyms and climbing and all sorts of things and sandboxes and all sorts of other things that just, again, I can only imagine the energy and the commotion that was going on and the fun that was had. But ultimately, one of the favorite memories of Mike Peranto, who is certainly a longtime White Bear guy, who grew up actually across the street from the Buckbees and Amy Benson. So they lived on Mike and his family and the Buckbees and Miss Benson lived on 7th Street, so just a few blocks down. But ultimately was one of the kids in the later years of the preschool, or kind of in the middle actually. And he talked about in an oral history that we have, he talks about his memory of the sandbox and how spectacular it was. And he said they had a sandbox that was huge. I mean, to me, maybe it was because I was a little kid, but it was gigantic, it seems. Kids could all jump in it and play, and we didn't have to stand around the side of it. It was so big, and it had white sand in it. So just kind of a fun image. It's hard to tell exactly if this is the sandbox or not, but it looks like it was substantial. You can see this particular version of it over the years, and I'm guessing that this is the white sand on the left there. But ultimately, so much fun digging and pushing, and again, all the toys and all the things. There was a constant flow of activity. And the kids seemed to be outside. Certainly they were inside as well, and we'll see some more of those photos too, but they seemed to be outside no matter whether it was summer or fall or spring or winter, as you've seen in some of the images. They built snowmen and did all sorts of activities. But here you can actually see this arbor piece is still at the Fillebrown House in the backyard along 4th Street, and the fence and these posts are still back there. And so ultimately, and actually this tree is still back there. So ultimately you can see where the swing set was and all the different pieces that fit right in. So I love these, a series of photos of them taking naps. One of our other alumni of Miss Benson's Nursery School, if you will, is Greg McNeely, who's also a longtime resident. And he talked about how much fun it was to be at the nursery school and what wonderful memories he has. But he specifically talked about laying their little mats out on the floor and laying down to take their naps and their rest. So I think they were only there for a portion of the day, typically in the morning, but they had a lot going on. So they obviously needed some downtime, and Miss Benson probably needed a little downtime for them as well. So you can see kids sprawled all over the house. I don't see any mats in this particular set, but you never know. What you can see in the background again is a little bit easier to see in some of these is the tables and chairs and all the pieces that are available around the corners. They seem to celebrate most of the holidays. You can see they're carving a pumpkin, or not carving, I guess they're decorating a pumpkin on the left there, and all sorts of gourds and different things, it looks like, or little pumpkins and things on the mantle on the right, and ghosts, of course. See Santa on the left here, in the Christmas tree and that they were laying under in the other previous shot or slides. Interestingly, the kids did a lot of role play, whether it be parenting. You see the little one with the Raggedy Ann doll and the stroller here, and there is a number of different things like that as time goes on. Decorating the trees. Looks like those are mostly paper ornaments or cards. Haircutting seemed to be, there were a number of hairstyling sort of photos, which is what I think is happening in these particular shots. There was one we didn't include it, I probably should have, but there was one where the person getting their hair cut, if you will, and I presume it's not truly, there are no real scissors involved, I hope, but the person getting their hair cut has a wonderful expression. We'll have to add that in for the next time. But all the usual, playing kitchen, playing mom or dad, and feeding the babies and putting them to bed and cooking and all of those things, certainly. And again, just to look at all the, I mean, there were a couple of different play kitchens and a number of doll beds and other things that came into the house, all sorts of activities and equipment, basically, just kind of intriguing. The one I love personally is on the left there with the iron. That's a lost art, certainly, and so just kind of fun to be able to see that happening and taking place here. And again, the role play with the gasoline and filling up those, you've got to fill up the trikes, make sure that they are gassed both in the house and outside. So they certainly had a lot of that going on. And then the experimentation, you can see the creative play again happening. And ultimately, you've got over on the left here some weights and pulleys kind of activity going on, and trying to figure out how to balance or do something. Ramps and other things going on the other side. It looks like most of the blocks on those shelves are out and about, and there are a lot of photos where that happens as well. Toys everywhere. You see them building things on the tables and creating stuff. I'm guessing that this is some sort of a bus or a train or something that they've used the chairs to line up and keep them going. But again, that sort of back and forth and interactiveness. Of course, the farm and the race cars and the trains and all of those. And again, in the background, you can see different educational things going on. So we are big at the Historical Society about not always just looking at what the picture is supposed to be of, the main point of the picture, but also what's going on. What can you tell from the back? This, of course, we can see is winter, so their kids are inside, which makes a lot of sense. And I think that most of the pictures where they are inside, it seems like they spent a lot of time outside in the summertime, but most of the pictures where they are inside, that you can see that the trees are bare, and here the lake is frozen. It looks like there's some fish houses, ice houses out on the lake as well at that point. But over here, it's interesting. This is again that sort of same spot on the wall where that little table was often positioned, and it looks like they were doing something with farms and barns and animals, and pulling that sort of theme through in lessons. So it seems that Miss Benson was teaching one way or another, whether it be creatively or more formally throughout these processes. You can see again, now they're outside and it's the weather's good and they're out playing and climbing, and the equipment changes over the years. There are different types of monkey bars and all sorts of different slides and seesaws and things. This, I think, is the same one that you saw inside just a little while ago. And again, not something that I'd love to see on those floors today, but that's okay. It happens. And it appears, and if anybody has information on this, I'd love to, well, certainly love to hear more about any of the activities or memories or folks who were at the nursery school. But it appears that in these particular shots, they're on a field trip to a farm. And I believe I'm able to identify that this is Mike Peranto here as a little one. So this would have been, it should have been probably the early 50s, early 1950s, and they went off to a farm. So probably a follow-up or an addition to that, whatever lessons they might have been doing with the barns and the animals. And this is a classic, as you can imagine, obviously not a real rooster, but certainly a thrill, I would imagine. So, and again, I think back to, my childhood and a lot of other childhoods, and as a parent, we always would laugh at the toys that we'd get or whatever for the kids, and of course you get the big dollhouse or the whatever, and half the time they're more interested in the box that it came in. And this is a perfect example of that. It looks like we've got a cowboy pirate, maybe something going on over here on the left in a box, and then I'm not sure what they're trying to do with the box over here, if they're trying to make it a sled or what in the spring, but they're certainly trying to make use of it and pull something off. And then I think, like most preschools or nursery schools, do today still, but it looks like they were doing some spring planting and sending gifts, maybe a Mother's Day gift or something home for the kids to take home to their parents, but all sorts of fun little pieces from that. And I love the popsicles. They don't look, the jackets and things on, it looks like it's fairly early spring from the trees and whatnot. But so they don't look like they're particularly warm, but pretty classic to be sitting out having a popsicle as soon as you possibly can in a Minnesota spring. I think we're all quite ready for that on our own here too. So those are the end of the official piece of the program. Oh, and let me actually, sorry, it just occurred to me that there was one more later in life photo that I didn't get to. Miss Benson's situation actually was such, and my guess is that she retired in 1956 because what happened is, so they were there at the Fillebrown from 46 to 56. What happened was her family, the Buckby family, which for all intents and purposes was her family, ended up moving to Arizona. And so Miss Benson actually went with them and ultimately was down there until she passed away. So I think that's probably had more to do with it. I think if Helen was amenable, they probably would have continued on potentially longer, but Mr. Buckby retired and everybody moved. So. All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody who's been with us tonight. I did remember to hit record, so Dan will go ahead and clean this up for us. Thank you, Dan, for making all of these photos look nice and putting everything together for us. There were a lot to choose from, and actually there are more images. We will be getting these images that are scanned. We'll be getting out on our website in our collections database as well. So you can certainly be able to look through them and see them. And I know we have at least one or two folks who I believe were students or did attend the nursery school on the program today. So feel free to send us comments or additions that might be fun. And if there are photos you'd like to look at, that would be great. We're happy to share them. That's what we're here for. So. But wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Dan. Have a great night. Thank you.